But what you argue is that in the Ukrainian case, as a Soviet legacy, the major industrial actors were basically under central command. So the Republican institutions, Soviet Ukrainian institutions, were weak vis-a-vis these actors. And as a carryover, they remained weak as a major kind of provider of corruption, in a sense. I found that a very interesting point. But you do add, there's also the transit question. So the leverage that Thane talks about. I'd like you to, maybe Thane could pinch in, to say a little more about this leverage, because the leverage as such is not equivalent to corruption, but leverage in practice in the last 20, 25 years, if I understood you correctly, was an amplifier of the rent swamps. Why so?
Well, I actually think we need to separate the concepts of leverage and rents. The point I have tried to make, maybe not so nicely in this paper, but in other publications, is that here you have Ukraine with some incredible potential leverage. Not only the transit system that made at one point Ukraine the largest hydrocarbon transit country in the world, but incredible storage facilities. All of these could have been used for leverage. Let's leave corruption separate. But instead of being used for leverage, it was used for rent seeking, and this made it impossible for it to be used for leverage, or greatly diminished its possibility to be used for leverage. So I don't want to say that leverage is the same as corruption. You can use leverage in other ways. Unfortunately, in the case of Ukraine, those infrastructures that could provide leverage were rather misused in other ways.
Quite right. Conceptually, they are separate, and yet they were joined at the hip because the Ukrainians, particularly in the early years, took advantage of the gas flowing through that was going on its way to Europe to help themselves. And stolen gas is free gas, and that became part of the rent flow. The Russians objected to that. They called it stealing, and which it was. And they started pushing back. So when you come to the interruptions of 2006, 2009, part of what's going on there is the Russians starting to lean on the Ukrainians and saying, we're going to find ways to make sure that you don't steal the gas in the way that you have been.
Just one comment on this stealing. I think we have a lot of informal evidence that a lot of this stealing, it took place, but it was not the stealing of an energy-poor state seeking to warm its population in the winter. It was stealing by private actors, and in many cases agreed by also actors on the other side.
Presentations. I would like simply to pose a question to both of you. Given now what we have seen, the massive corruption by Gazprom through various intermediaries of Ukraine, and that it's all declining anyhow, why not stop it altogether? Is there any reason for Ukraine to continue buying gas from Gazprom? This has been persistently the main source of corruption in Ukraine. Of course, you're right, Margarita, that the Ukrainian state has been weak. But if we want to reform the Ukrainian state, should we stop this? Can the weak Ukrainian state really reform itself if it has this economic warfare that Russia's gas trade, both through transit and through export of gas, is to Ukraine? Thank you.
Your comments?
I'm going to be short in my comments. One of the reasons Ukraine's gas consumption has been reduced so significantly in the last couple of years exactly because of the contraction in the economy and because the eastern territories are not included in the statistics. But up to this day, Ukraine has not found a full replacement for Russian gas. Even the reverse supplies, which Thane promised to tell us more about, either physical or contractual reverses, can provide part of that, but you cannot cut it fully. But when you asked your question, I thought you meant why not end it all, meaning why not end Ukrainian transit? But, or do you mean both? Well, Ukraine continues to receive $2 million in transit fees per year. Ukraine has not found a way to replace all of the gas it receives from Russia, and the restructuring of the economy that would be needed to not use this gas would be something that I don't think would be politically feasible at this point. But let's hear another perspective.
Well, excellent question. I think it's always instructive to ask the gas molecules themselves where they want to go. If you ask the molecules on strictly economic grounds, Ms. Molecule, where do you get your best value? The answer is by going to Europe, by going to Ukraine, and by going through Ukraine. There's no question about it. If you look, for example, at eastern Ukraine, even as far west as Kiev, a molecule that simply crosses the Russian border has very short pipeline distance and lands in Kiev is the cheapest molecule around. Couple that with the fact that at this moment the Russians are have a glut of gas. They don't know what to do with the stuff. They went ahead and developed the Yamal Peninsula. They have now, in other words, created the next generation of gas. It's not cheap, but hell, the capital costs are now sunk, and the operating costs are very cheap. So the Russians can undersell anybody if you just consider a straight economic fight among different sources of gas or even different sources of energy. So there is an economic role for Russian gas. The question is whether you can make it a transparent transaction and make it open and commercial.
But my question was price differentials vis-a-vis European imports. That's not happening. They're getting one price. Are there evidence of reselling at higher cost than the price that they're paying Europeans, or not? Since overwhelmingly now the gas that's flowing in is coming from Europe.
I'm not quite following the question, sorry.
Maybe,
I think what Dominique is talking about is about those arbitrage possibilities that were possible when you had $50 per 1,000 cubic meters Ukrainian price and $300 European price. And that is a very different situation now. However, and maybe I shouldn't get into some of the discussions we'll have in the next hour, a lot of those price differentials are happening not necessarily in terms of import gas, but are happening concerning the price that is paid for gas produced in Ukraine. And gas produced in Ukraine is priced at a very low level. Some of this gas is supposed to be used only for residential users and schools, etc., but it's used for others. So there is some reselling there. And in the oil sector, there's also some price limitations for oil produced domestically. So there's where a lot of the action is now.
Want to pick up on that? Or?
Inside Russia, inside Ukraine, Margarita is quite right. There are all kinds of strange things involving the independent producers. But where the imports are concerned, the Russian gas and the European gas are very roughly at the same level. The reason arbitrage is no longer available on the same scale as in the good old days is quite simply that now you have to actually pay real money. You're not in a barter economy anymore. Not only that, but you have to pay real money at what are arguably market clearing prices. So where is the opportunity for arbitrage?
You actually have to prepay even?
Well, indeed, there is that element. Compare that, say, to the kinds of stuff that Tymoshenko used to pull off in the old days, where she would get gas in exchange for, say, supplies to the military. How were those supplies priced? You know, so it's funny business both ways. Then, according to rumor, at least according to the Russians, she never delivered on the military supplies, which is why she was wanted in Russia. Maybe that's one factor in the Timoshenko-Putin relationship, and so on. I mean, you're in a different world of shadows, and now you see me, now you don't, in the 1990s. And that, the basis for that has very largely disappeared. It's a much more commercial business than it was.
And Margarita's point about now the action shifts to domestic production, and what was also striking in your paper is that this is the one and only sector when there's no decline in production. That's what you argued in the paper, or not significant decline, or largely, if I understood you correctly.
We all remember those wonderful Roadrunner cartoons where Reddy Coyote is poised above the canyon and is about to drop. That's independent gas production in Ukraine. There are basically two companies that have managed to boost production over the last couple of years. It's because they had started drilling programs back a couple of years ago, and they have favorable geology. Even now, their growth rate is slowing down, and next year it will vanish. Unless the Ukrainian government takes strong action to improve, in particular, the tax environment that they face, we will not see growth like we did over the last couple of years from the independent gas producers.